Woman finds tiny house in forest, turns pale when she sees what's inside. Mike and Teresa had no clue what they were dealing with when they stumbled across a tiny stone house hidden deep in the middle of a massive forest. They tried searching online for any mention of it, but nothing came up. It was like this place didn't exist, like no one had ever seen it before. At first, they were just confused by the strange little house. But the moment they peeked inside, that confusion quickly turned into uneasiness. They stood there, frozen for a second, not sure what to make of it. Why would there be a small stone house right in the heart of the forest? It looked really old, like it had been there for decades. Slowly, cautiously, they began to move closer. The closer they got, the more they realized something wasn't right. A strange sound was coming from inside. It didn't sound like anything natural to the woods. Teresa pulled out her phone and used the flashlight to see through the small opening. "Mike, you're not going to believe this," she said. He saw her face change as she reached her hand slowly into the dark space, trying to grab something. What had she just seen? What could possibly be inside this tiny house? And why had no one ever found it before? Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Mike and Teresa weren't easily rattled. After hiking together for over 15 years, there wasn't much that caught them off guard anymore. They were experienced and knew how to handle whatever the trails threw their way. Over the years, they'd run into all kinds of things: abandoned camps, wild animals in places they shouldn't be, and even once had to call the police after stumbling on something suspicious. But nothing, not even that, would come close to what they were about to uncover. It was a typical Saturday when they packed up for a long hike through the nature preserve near their home. They followed their usual checklist, making sure they had everything they needed. This time, they were planning to go deep into the woods, farther than usual. It would take them most of the afternoon to get there. Their friend Jonathan was coming along. He wasn't much of a hiker, so they were surprised when he showed real interest in joining. Still, Mike and Teresa didn't question it. They liked having him around. But what they didn't know was that Jonathan had his own reasons for wanting to come. When they got to the edge of the forest to meet Jonathan, the weather was just about perfect for late morning. The only thing that felt a little off was the big shadow cast over the woods, giving everything a slightly eerie look. As they moved deeper into the trees, the path to the forest center turned out to be no walk in the park. But Mike and Teresa were used to this kind of terrain. They kept an eye on Jonathan, who clearly had a harder time with the steeper sections. Still, he didn't complain and kept going without hesitation. Strangely, they hadn't seen much wildlife all day. It didn't hit Mike until later, but it was definitely odd. The preserve was usually full of movement, rabbits darting around, squirrels jumping through branches. Even if they weren't always visible, there was always background noise. But today, just a few birds circled high above, and that was it. On top of that, something else was off. The trails didn't seem to line up with what was shown on their maps. The markings were different, and none of the paths seemed to lead directly to the center. Were they lost? Teresa wondered aloud if maybe they weren't supposed to be in that part of the preserve, but neither of them remembered ever seeing any warning signs. They tried using their phones to pull up a satellite view, but they had no signal this deep into the woods. Jonathan pointed toward one of the trails and suggested they keep moving. Maybe they'd come across something interesting. Mike and Teresa agreed and followed his lead. They stuck to the same direction, going deeper into the forest. But Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Eventually, Teresa paused to check their location again, and this time she was able to pick up a faint signal on their GPS tracker. It showed they were actually pretty close to the center of the preserve. Relieved to know they hadn't gone the wrong way, she didn't even think to wonder what might be waiting for them when they got there. Once they stepped into the heart of the forest, the trees opened up into a wide clearing. Sunlight poured in through gaps in the canopy above, making the whole area feel strangely bright. Jonathan suddenly looked thrilled and walked ahead a little faster. But when Mike and Teresa caught up and stepped fully into the clearing, they noticed something unusual. Off in the shadowy part of the field, Mike spotted something strange and cautiously walked toward it. As he got closer, he tripped. His foot caught on something hidden in the grass. He went down hard. Teresa rushed over to help him untangle his boot and get back on his feet. But when they looked around, Jonathan was gone. As Mike and Teresa searched the clearing for Jonathan, they noticed something strange. Wires stretched low across the ground, circling the area. They were about shin height and seemed like they were meant to trip someone. That made both of them uneasy. Curious and a little on edge, they decided to follow the wires to see where they led. Up ahead, Mike realized that the shape he'd noticed earlier was actually a small stone house. Covered in ivy and clearly weathered, it looked like it had been sitting there for decades. But then, why would anyone bother running wires around an old house like that? Could they have been set up for something else? Mike stepped in closer to take a better look. Maybe the place wasn't abandoned after all. Just then, Jonathan appeared from the other side of the building. He'd been looking at the same thing, trying to figure out what the wires were for. He led them to a spot beside the house where even more wires were set up, some at different heights. But before they could make sense of it, a strange sound suddenly echoed from somewhere nearby. They leaned in, trying to figure it out. It sounded faintly like ticking. The open space in the clearing made it tough to tell where it was coming from, but Teresa moved toward the back of the house and pinpointed the noise. Something or someone was definitely still inside. Mike hesitated. If it was some kind of explosive device, getting closer could be risky, but Teresa and Jonathan were too curious to walk away. Teresa found a low window on the ground floor and peered inside. At first, it just looked like an empty room. It was too dark to see much. She pulled out her flashlight and held it up to the glass, hoping to get a better view. That's when she spotted something. A small box connected to the wires. It didn't seem dangerous at first glance, but she needed to know what it was and why someone had left it out there, in the middle of nowhere. Jonathan stepped in to help and gently worked the tiny window open. Teresa carefully reached in and tugged on the wires beneath the sill, slowly pulling the box toward her. She turned it over in her hand, and her eyes widened. She quickly showed it to Mike and Jonathan. On the back was a short antenna, and a row of red lights blinked steadily, flashing like a warning. Mike stared at it, realizing what it probably was, some kind of sensor, maybe even an alarm. And if that was true, someone out there already knew they were there. Teresa had a bad feeling. Something about all of it felt wrong. She wanted to leave the forest right away, but Jonathan and Mike weren't ready to go. They were fired up, running on adrenaline. They needed to understand what was going on. Why would someone go through the trouble of hiding a device like that in such a remote place? What was so special about this little house? Just then, Jonathan noticed something high up in one of the trees. He couldn't tell what it was from a distance, but he felt like he had to check it out. Teresa tried to stop them. She pleaded with them to forget about it and just turn back. Why were they so drawn to this? When Jonathan finally saw it up close, he froze. It was a camera carefully attached to the tree. Now it was certain. Someone knew they were there. Not only that, but someone might be watching them right now. This old stone house clearly mattered to someone. But why? Was there something more hidden inside? Then Teresa heard something, a noise in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. Someone, or something, was getting closer. She ran to Mike and Jonathan and warned them. They were still searching around the house but hadn't found anything useful. As soon as they heard her, they knew it was time to go. They'd come back later if they had to, but they couldn't risk being caught. The three of them took off running without wasting another second. Who knew what kind of person might be coming? Jonathan held tight to the device. They couldn't leave it behind. He was determined to figure out what it was. Not long after, a voice called out from behind them. It sounded like a shout. Teresa's fear spiked again, and then the device started making noise. Again, a loud, repetitive beeping. Mike turned to Jonathan and yelled for him to drop it. "They're tracking us through that thing." But Jonathan refused. He wouldn't let it go. Why was this device so important to him? Was there more he wasn't telling them? Suddenly, Teresa caught her foot on a branch and fell hard. Mike didn't hesitate. He turned back to help her up. But Jonathan didn't stop. He kept running. Mike yelled after him, but he didn't even glance back. That's when the barking started. Dogs. Somewhere behind them, getting closer. Mike's stomach dropped. They had to move. Fast. But all that mattered now was getting out safely. Teresa was in pain and couldn't run anymore. Mike stepped in front of her without thinking. He wasn't going to let anything get near his wife. She meant too much to him. He'd do whatever it took to protect her. Then, out of nowhere, the barking stopped. Someone must have called the dog off. Moments later, a man stepped out from the trees. Mike tensed up at first, but the man didn't look threatening. Instead, he simply asked, "What are you doing out here?" Just hearing someone speak calmly was a relief. Mike felt a wave of tension leave his body. At least this wasn't going to end in a chase. The man introduced himself as Peter. He said he was the forest ranger for this area and explained he was out there because one of the devices in the forest had suddenly activated. Then he started asking them a lot of questions. Mike and Teresa explained everything honestly. They told him they'd just come across the little stone house by chance and had no idea they weren't supposed to be near it. They also let him know that their friend Jonathan had taken the device. Peter checked something on his handheld tracker and saw that Jonathan was already near the edge of the forest. It was too late to catch up to him. He offered to take Mike and Teresa back to his nearby cabin so he could explain what was going on. Once they got to the cabin, Peter sat them down and gave a bit more context. He said the tiny house had been under quiet surveillance for some time. When Mike asked why, Peter said he couldn't share the full story. What he did say was that the structure used to be part of an old amusement park that had shut down years ago. As a ranger, Peter felt it was his responsibility to keep an eye on what remained. That device Jonathan had found? It was actually one of Peter's tracking tools. He'd accidentally left it during a previous visit and had been trying to locate it ever since. It was expensive and not something he wanted to lose. But now Jonathan had it. He was still out there, probably thinking he'd stumbled onto something big. Teresa tried calling him to explain, but he didn't answer. It went straight to voicemail. Knowing how stubborn Jonathan could be, Peter offered to go with them and help talk to him. He wanted to clear things up and hopefully get the device back without any trouble. The group returned to the edge of the forest, scanning the area for any sign of Jonathan. At first, there was nothing, but then they heard a voice calling out from nearby. Jonathan stepped out from between the trees, looking calm and a little relieved. He seemed genuinely glad to see that everyone was okay. But something was missing. He no longer had the device on him. Peter didn't waste any time and asked where it was. Jonathan didn't back down. He didn't seem the least bit bothered by Peter's serious tone. And he refused to say where the device was. What made it so important to him? Later that evening, Peter finally opened up and told them the full story. The reason the house was being watched was because a rare animal species had been spotted near it. Peter believed he'd made a huge discovery, maybe even the most important one of his career. He wanted to protect the area and keep anyone else from taking credit, which is why he left the tracking device behind. Jonathan looked disappointed. He'd clearly thought he'd uncovered something completely different. After a moment, he finally told them where he'd hidden the device. He also apologized for leaving Mike and Teresa behind earlier. It hadn't been the right thing to do. In the end, they all came to an agreement. They would respect Peter's work and let him handle things his way. A few weeks later, Mike and Teresa saw a story in the newspaper. Peter had officially confirmed his discovery, and he'd even mentioned them by name, thanking them for their help. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and tap the bell so you never miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.